All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for this morning's program, or I guess wherever you are, maybe this evening's. Picasso's Women. Women have served as important collaborators and muses throughout the history of art, and that is essentially true for the most celebrated artist of the 20th century. We're going to learn more about the women in Picasso's life and how his visual innovations often reflected his relationships. And this is all led by the wonderful art historian Jane Oneail, who's the founder of Culturally Curious, a company that curates and delivers art appreciation programs for audiences worldwide. With a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University, Jane has worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including as executive director of the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, as well as senior educator at the Currier Museum of Art. She has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. And I again want to thank the Corning Community Impact and Investment Foundation, as well as the Friends of the Library for co-sponsoring. So all 150 plus of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jane for joining us this morning. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Picasso. You're in for a treat. These are some salacious stories here, and his work is always interesting, always inspiring, but some of these behind-the-scenes stories about his relationships are kind of jaw-dropping, I would say. So today we're going to get a nice overview of Picasso's life and work, a brief one. We only have an hour together, but we're going to do that by way of his relationships with women. Picasso once said, "To my misfortune and maybe my delight, I place things according to my love affairs." Now, Picasso, it's probably no secret, had very strong opinions about women. He once said there are only two types of women, uh, goddesses and doormats. So, think of where you might be on that spectrum there. So we're going to get started kind of zooming out just a little bit, thinking about muses in general. We're looking at these two great images here. On the left, a painting by the French neoclassical painter who imagined the Renaissance painter Raphael and his muse. So here he is working on a painting of her, but also embracing her. So a painting that was done, roughly 300 years after Raphael lived, but we're sort of romanced by the idea of this kind of inspiration that happens when there is like an object of desire. And we see this very affectionate gaze from Andy Warhol over here on the right as he's looking at, I believe this is Edie Sedgwick, right? And 1965. So when it comes to artists and their muses, we already have this sense that the muses inspire their work. And it's traditionally a female model who's playing this role of the muse. And there's oftentimes implied a notion of a love affair existing between the artist and the model here. Now, it's not always that cut and dry. There are artists like Edgar Degas, the French Impressionists, who had more complicated feelings about his models, about the women who posed for him. His fellow Impressionist Edward Manet once said of Degas, he could never love a woman. And we see that in some of his paintings. He cuts off their heads, the ballerinas over here on stage, or he asks his models to hold uncomfortable poses for very long periods of time. So maybe those feelings about women were kind of seeping into his paintings. And how does this all play out when it comes to Picasso? Well, you get a little bit of both, the love and maybe a little bit of the contempt. So what we're looking at right now is a work called The Painter. It's from 1934, and it's right here in New England at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And here we see Picasso painting an artist. So we can almost think of this as like a self-portrait. It's probably safe to assume that it is. And he's painted with like crispness, this clarity. And then he has his nude female model kind of splayed out in front of him. And the model is distorted, she's exaggerated, and the way she is painted is with like this thick impasto. The black outline is sort of bleeding into the lavenders and the aquas that he's using to describe her flesh. So when it comes to Picasso, it's tempting to wonder if an image like this is saying something about his relationship with the woman in his life at that moment. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this hour together. We've got this very intimate picture of Picasso on the screen here. It's from 1955. Honestly, when it comes to Picasso, there are too many women to cover. We could go through all of his lovers. We could go through his relationship with his mother to his daughters and his granddaughters. We'd be here all day. So, over the course of his very long life, he had a few very significant relationships, and most of them did not end well. Believe it or not, two of them were driven to mental breakdowns, and two of them actually committed suicide. One of his biographers, Patrick O'Brien, observed Picasso's feeling for women oscillated between extreme tenderness on one hand and violent hatred on the other, the midpoint being dislike, if not contempt. Whew, that says a lot, right? So we have these one, two, three, four, five women that we'll be looking at today, right after we get a nice little introduction to Picasso himself. Okay. So here we're going to delve into Picasso, but here we have the dates of his life as well, just to get us sort of situated in time. And here is Picasso standing in his studio in Cannes, France. This was from 1956. Now, it's safe to say that Pablo Picasso was the most dominant figure in the world of art in the first half of the 20th century, if not all of the 20th century. And his work really came to define modernism. Along with Georges Braque, he pioneered Cubism. He also invented collage and made major contributions to symbolism and surrealism. He was famously charismatic, and his behavior, in particular his relationships with women, have come to embody this sort of modern notion of what a bohemian modern artist was really all about. It sort of lives in our popular imagination that way. Now, though he passed away just over 50 years ago, Picasso continues to be one of the most bankable artists on the planet. Since his death, he's been the most reproduced, most exhibited, most stolen, and most faked artist of all time. He once compared himself to King Midas. You know, everything he touches turns to gold. And that may be true for his art. We'll see how it played out for the ladies in his life. So this is a series of self-portraits by the artist from starting at age 15, going all the way up to age 90 over here at the bottom right. And we can see there's a real evolution in his style during this very long career. Now, he worked in a variety of media, including ceramics, but he thought of himself above all as a painter. And so during this long, prolific career, we can see he's got a number of really innovative ideas in terms of his approach to painting. And all of this is sort of at play with these relationships. So here we're looking at a very early photograph of the artist on the left and a portrait that he made of his mother when he was just 15 years old. That was done in 1896. So Picasso was Spanish. He was born in Spain and he spent most of his life in France. He came from an artistic family. His father was an artist, and supposedly his very first word was the word pencil. His father started giving him art lessons when he was right around the age of 7. So, right around the age that we see here in this photo. Look at the confidence there. I love it. Picasso demonstrated this extraordinary talent in his early years, and he was painting in this realistic or naturalistic manner throughout his childhood and into his teen years, as we can see in the portrait of his mother. And his mother always believed in him, really championed him as a young man. She said, If he were a soldier, he would have been a general. If he was a monk, he would have become a pope. And Picasso said in response, instead, I was a painter and I became Picasso. So no shortage of confidence in the family. Once Picasso's formal training was completed in Spain, he moved to France to just kind of be at the epicenter of the art world. And he was just 20 years old at the time. And he would use women as models throughout his career. Sometimes they were people that he had brief encounters with, and others had a huge influence over him. The woman with the crossed arms from 1902 that we see on the left is representative of his blue period, where he was mostly doing these monochromatic paintings on sort of melancholy subjects, highly influenced by his own depression and poverty at the time. Now, that woman was most likely a hospital slash prison patient, and she was not necessarily someone that the artist knew. And though the picture is grounded in realism, we can see her sad face and her body, her clothes are simplified. This is just kind of a first gentle step away from the realism that he had mastered as a teenager. On the right is his very famous portrait of Gertrude Stein, painted in 1906. It's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, Gertrude Stein was an American expatriate living in Paris, and she was a very influential patron of the arts. Really, one of the first and only people who was buying modern art, including works from Picasso, before before Gertrude Stein started supporting him as an artist. Picasso was oftentimes burning his own art to stay warm in his freezing cold Paris apartment. So Stein claimed that she sat for this portrait on 90 different occasions. And I have to believe that that is a wild exaggeration, but Picasso certainly wrestled long and hard with the painting of her face and her head here. So one day, after completely painting her face out and starting over altogether, he said, I can't see you any longer when I look. And sometime later, without the benefit of his model sitting in front of him, he comes up with this completed head. It's asymmetrical, the eyelids are sort of heavy, and they reflect his recent encounter with African sculpture and foreshadow his adoption of Cubism. So this work here is a pivotal painting in his career, arguably the first Cubist painting ever, and here we see this dramatic fragmentation and flattening of forms. This is, as I always say, this is like receiving a box from Amazon and breaking down that cardboard, taking something three-dimensional and making it flat. The painting is a depiction of five naked prostitutes. They are not rendered as soft or sensual here, but they are hardened and slightly terrifying, right? And this has always been cited as evidence of Picasso's contemptuous feelings for the opposite sex. In fact, Picasso had a number of personal experiences at brothels, beginning at a very early age. His father would attend Sunday Mass, and then beginning at age 13, he would visit, he would take his son, Pablo Picasso, to the brothels with him. So many scholars suggest the idea that women sort of existed in Picasso's mind for his convenience and for his pleasure, and that dominated not just his life, but his work as well. So this next work here is an example of Cubism in a slightly later form known as analytical Cubism. The woman he was romantically involved with at the time was named Marcel Humbert, and he called this picture Ma Jolie in reference to, or which translates to like my pretty one. So this is a portrait of his lover at the time. These women always appear in his pictures, and it's far from a traditional portrait. The figure almost disappears here into this network of these flat edges, these straight lines, and these semi-transparent planes. But there are clues here that it is, in fact, a woman. You're just going to have to trust me on this if you don't see it. But there is sort of a strong diagonal form that suggests like a head and a body. And she's supposed to be strumming a guitar, which maybe you can see the guitar strings right here at the center near the bottom. So it's just a very vague representation of the female form. Picasso wrote in a letter, I love her very much, and I will write this into my painting. So at least this is one woman that he loved, and this is how she showed up on the canvas. Now, during the 1920s, Picasso became very interested in surrealism. In fact, he even claimed to invent the word surreal, though he was far from the movement's leader. So, at the core of surrealism, the whole movement was this idea of working without forethought or intention, and sort of allowing your unconscious to take over your creation of a work of art. And Picasso refused to surrender his intellect in terms of making art. But he did embrace certain aspects of surrealism. For him, it was less about the unconscious mind and more about the distortion of reality. So Picasso was interested in art as a vehicle for expressing imaginative responses to the real world. And what we will be seeing along the way is his adoption of the eerie erotica of the French surrealist art, which often portrayed women as nude and contorted and disjointed forms resembling insects or birds, which I think you can sort of get from these works from the late 1920s over here on the left and the early 1930s on the right. So we'll wrap up this quick look at Picasso, this general overview of his relationships with women, by acknowledging one last important fact about the artist, and that was he was a full blown celebrity. This is a photograph of him at work with none other than Bridget Bardot just hanging over his shoulder, watching him paint. So, with all of the relationships that we'll consider today, let's keep in mind that a liaison with Picasso held the promise of status, maybe even celebrity, certainly money, and the opportunity to be immortalized by a modern master. So, there's a lot at play here, right? All right, so we are going to get started with Olga Koklova. And and what's important to keep in mind here is that Olga was his first bride, but hardly his first love. He had already had a handful of affairs at this point, probably many more lovers, but Olga was the first one to get the ring. Okay, so here are Olga and Picasso. They met in 1917. He was 36 at the time. She was 26. And she was a Russian ballet dancer. And they met when Picasso was actually designing the sets and the costumes for a ballet. Picasso at this time was like a bohemian. He's unconventional and he's totally indifferent to social status. But she's a ballerina and she's very concerned with appearances, rightfully so, in her field. And she came from this bourgeois background. So there is this idea of like, you need to look and behave a certain way. So Koklova becomes this ever present force in Picasso's studio. And over their nearly 2 decades of life together, the way she looked in his paintings took on many forms, sometimes even verging on the religious. So here we have our first look at a representation of Koklova by Picasso alongside a photograph that he probably used as like source material here. When the couple first set up their home in Paris, it was a happy home. Their marriage was working out, at least at first, despite these differences that they had. When she appears in Picasso's life, Cubism is going full force, but she did not want to be represented that way. Again, this is somebody who lives their life on stage. They want to kind of control the way they look. So she demanded that her portraits of her be made in an academic style, a style that most art historians refer to as being part of Picasso's neoclassical period. So this portrait of Olga done in the armchair from 1918 was created the year that they were married. And Picasso had just gone to Naples. He got very interested in the classical past. He continued to study it at the Louvre when he returned to Paris and was probably looking at paintings by the neoclassical painter Ingres as inspiration for this work about Koklova here. And you can see a lot of similarities with the portrait of his wife. You see Koklova's pose, the curves of her neck and her arms here, the elegant dress, the embroidered armchair that she's sitting on. This is all signifying her status as part of the bourgeois. And it's very similar to the Ingres portrait that we see on the left. So interestingly, Picasso doesn't finish it. He leaves the background blank. He never gives the chair legs. He never gives his ballerina wife feet. She's just kind of hovering there, unfinished. And it seems as though this was Picasso's opportunity to kind of push back on traditions, on what was expected of a finished portrait at the time. And no doubt he was pushing back against his wife's wishes. Now, many images of Olga Koklova are pictures of her sitting down, reading, looking pensive, looking lost in thought. These are the kinds of images that dominate the 1920s. Um, Remember, for the sake of her husband, she gives up her career in ballet. She later suffers a leg injury, which meant that she had to be seated through most of their honeymoon, actually, and in the early years in their Paris apartment. This is also a time when the Russian Revolution is happening and then a subsequent civil war. So this Russian ballerina is oftentimes reading these letters from home with just devastating news in them. So this sense of sadness kind of permeates these images. But shortly after that, there is joy because Koklova gives birth to the couple's son, Paolo, in 1921. And he ends up being Picasso's only legitimate son. So most of these works are right around the year 1921. Now, Picasso was overjoyed to be a father, and he portrayed his wife and his child in these kind of Madonna and child inspired scenes. The portraits are full of tenderness and love. The artist went on to paint many, many portraits of Paolo. These are images are representative of Picasso's neoclassical period as well. And he renders Koklova and even the baby as these massive, weighty forms, as impressive as ancient sculptures. Now, what happens next is sort of shocking, though, isn't it? In the mid 1920s, the relationship between Picasso and Koklova begins to deteriorate. The family is wealthy, they have enough money that Koklova is not really needed in the household. There are people to take care of her son, there are people to take care of everything, and she has little to do and a sort of unfulfilled life. And her husband's extracurriculars at this time are causing her increased anxiety. One art historian, clearly a male one, said, Olga was increasingly jealous of Picasso, not without reason, hurled accusations at him, and was forever making a scene. On a trip to Monte Carlo, she was particularly hurt by the fact that her husband was so interested in painting young women. Actually, most of the young women he was finding there were ballerinas from the company of dancers that she used to belong to. And this hurt all the more because she had sacrificed her own ballet career for him. So we see in this work kind of that influence of surrealism, a little bit of cubism with the flattening of forms here. But there's this sense of drama and nervous energy. Her face and her body are distorted here. Her form is flattened like those prostitutes from the Demoiselles d'Avignon. And although there is the expression, the suggestion of like freedom and exuberance here with this beautiful releve, at the same time, you have to wonder if the distortion is a reflection of Picasso's changing feelings about his wife. And maybe that's undeniable by the time we get to this one. This is called Woman in a Red Armchair from 1929, and it is a portrait of his wife, Olga. Now she's a monster. She has this head that's in the shape of an arrow. She's got eyes that are oriented in two different directions. Her teeth are alongside one side of her head over here, and her hair is just rendered as these like three thick clumps of hair. Her breasts are just these little triangles that are pointing up towards her face. For Picasso, his wife's jealousy was unfathomable, and it conjured in him a contempt for women. So we've come a very long way in the space of a decade from that earlier portrait of her in an armchair. And as this crisis in their marriage deepened, he increasingly deviated away from realistic portraits of Koklova. Several of his major relationships resulted in psychological trauma for the women involved. And Picasso seemed to be completely aware of the emotional impact his work had on his relationships. He told one of his biographers, "It must be painful for a girl to see in a painting that she's on the way out." And I think that's certainly what we see in this image over here on the right. So who is on the way in? Let me introduce you to young Marie-Thérèse Walter. We can see her here in two photographs. She was 17 years old when she met Picasso in 1927. He was 29 years older than her. One of Picasso's main requirements for a mistress, or I guess he had two main requirements. One was that the woman was kind of submissive to him, and the other was that they were shorter than him, which is, no pun intended, a tall order because Picasso was only 5'4", so he had to find these very petite women. So apparently he spotted Marie Therese leaving the metro station one day, and he went over to her and said, essentially, "I have to paint you." She had no idea who he was, and he actually brought her to a bookstore and showed her a book about his paintings. And within a week, they were sleeping together. Now, at this point, Picasso's son is 5, and supposedly Koklova did not find out about Marie Therese for another 8 years. Now, biographers, art historians, they allege that Walter was perhaps the most enduring love of Picasso's life, perhaps the only woman that made him truly happy. Historians call her his golden muse. She was innocent and at the same time sort of sensual and voluptuous. And like I said, she was kind of submissive and mostly tolerant of Picasso's bad behaviors. He was intensely attracted to her athleticism, her youth, and her positive energy here. So let's take a look at how he portrayed her. I love these paintings, they're just gorgeous. Walter was always featured with these gentle, round shapes and very bright colors, oftentimes with this lavender skin contrasted with like a Kelly green. I love the big free flowing curves here and that contrast of colors. I think everything just kind of pops. She's got the beautiful blonde hair as well. As one art historian put it, to Picasso, the sleeping Walter is free of constraint, an object of passionate desire, and a living dream of the dewy intoxication of youth. In repose, Walter emanates serenity and calm, and it's with her that Picasso is said to have experienced true domestic harmony. So remember, all of this is an affair that's happening, and he was smitten. He began carving their initials into his paintings. I mean, he still has to be secretive around his wife, right? But he's acting like an infatuated teenager. Walter apparently once said, "He told me that I had saved his life, but I had no idea what that meant." But after around 1930, he starts creating very conspicuous images of her that are sensual. So here she is sleeping once again, but we'll notice that there's a breast exposed as she's sleeping here. So there's this eroticism to it. It's worth noting too that she's resting in a red armchair, and this is painted just a year after he painted his wife in the same red armchair. So you can sort of see who's on the rise and who's going down here. So in 1932, a suite of works featuring Marie Therese Walter were put on display. And you can imagine what it must have felt like for Olga Koklova to walk into this exhibition and to see nude Marie Therese Walter all over the walls. This painting here is called Nude Green Leaves and Bust, and it once again shows Picasso's love for Walter was was more physical and erotic than it was like rational and cerebral. Most people didn't really think of Marie Therese Walter as like his intellectual equal. She was smart, but she wasn't necessarily an intellectual. And perhaps Picasso's even suggesting that by placing these black stripes across her body. It's hard to understand what they are. This one sort of looks like fabric, it kind of becomes a shadow, but this one here separates her head from her body. Now, incidentally, this painting that we're looking at was sold in, I think it was 2012, for the equivalent of $160 million in today's money. So for a brief moment, it was one of the most expensive works of art ever sold. All right. Now, what happens next? You can probably guess. Marie Therese Walter gives birth to a girl in 1935, and this is Picasso's first daughter, nicknamed Maya. We see her on the left at age 3 months, and then on the right, a portrait of Walter nursing the baby. By the time of Maya's birth, Picasso was already seeing several other women, but Picasso would go and visit Walter and Maya on the weekends, and then during the weekdays, he spent time with several other lovers. So the way he portrays Marie Therese Walter begins to change. It's not a consistent change, but we begin to see new sides of her as a young mother, and we begin to see that Picasso starts to distort her. Uh, though the image on the left, it's just gorgeous. She's like this ethereal beauty, but there's a seriousness and a directness to the portrait. Actually, sort of reminds me of some of the early portraits of Koklova here. It's one of his most realistic depictions of her as well. But the painting on the right is called Sleeper with Shutters from 1936. And he's done away with Marie Therese Walter's normally bright color palette, the Kelly greens and the lavenders and all of that. Instead, we've got this kind of yucky greenish gray here. And although the title says that she's sleeping, she sort of looks emotionally distraught to me. Her breasts are exposed again, but it almost seems more like they're the utilitarian breasts of a young mother rather than anything sensual. It seems like there's been a shift here. Picasso actually referred to this period as the worst time in his life. Now, his wife Olga knew about Marie Therese Walter, but she was unwilling to give him a divorce. And I can imagine that Marie Therese Walter was pretty upset about this as well. So Picasso's stuck, they were stuck, and yet he still had other women in his life. As one art historian wrote, Marie Therese put up with his need for other women because she knew he loved her best. So, who are the other women? Who else is in Picasso's life? A woman named Henriette Theodora Markovich, aka Dora Maar. We can see her here. We can see night and day with Marie Therese Walter, right? So a few months after the birth of his daughter Maya in 1936, Picasso began a relationship with Dora Maar, who we see in this photograph by the photographer Man Ray. Dora Maar was raised in Argentina. She was fluent in Spanish, which meant she could speak Picasso's mother tongue with him. She was fiercely intelligent and intellectual equal to Picasso, and she expected more out of Picasso than most of his other lovers did, certainly more than Marie Therese Walter did. She was a talented artist in her own right, a photographer and a painter. She had attended the premier art school in Paris, the École des Beaux-Arts, and had a nice circle of artist friends as well. Now, I love a good rom-com and a meet cute story, but the way Picasso and Dora Maar met is like the worst meet cute story of all time. She was a very, very dramatic person, and apparently she was sitting at a cafe in Paris with a knife and stabbing the spaces in between her fingers. It's just like a game to draw blood, essentially. It's a pretty dark thing to do. And Picasso was fascinated by it. He was just watching her. And when she was done, he asked for one of her bloody gloves. And that's how this affair started. Dora Maar was 29 years old at the time. He was 55, and they soon began living together. Her parents were not in favor of this relationship, to the point that as she was talking to her mother about it on the phone, her mother had a stroke and died. She was so upset about it. So this relationship between Picasso and Dora Maar was physically abusive, it was emotionally abusive, and altogether it lasted for about 9 years. And during that time, Picasso did not end his relationship with Marie Therese Walter, and he was still married to Olga Koklova. So complicated to say the least. So how did this play out in his artwork? Well, we have this notion that Marie Therese Walter and Dora Maar were at odds with each other in real life and in Picasso's paintings. The complexity of these romantic entanglements were artistically fruitful for Picasso, but they seem to be emotionally wrenching for all of the parties involved. These portraits were both painted in 1937, and they are both fascinating and alluring abstractions in their own right. We have Walter, who's still these curving lines and like cool skin tones. She's soft and sweet. And then over here, Dora Maar appears more mature, perhaps more self-possessed. Both women have faces that seem to show them simultaneously in profile and frontally. And over here, Walter's fingers are oversized and kind of rounded. Picasso would often show Dora Maar with very pointy fingers over here and painted fingernails. So they are a study in contrasts in so many ways. And then this happens. Very quickly, things begin to change for Dora Maar, at least so far as Picasso was depicting her. She becomes prickly. She becomes this wailing figure, literally broken by this cubist faceting. So we have these sharp, angular lines that Picasso was using to portray her, and it's in such stark contrast to the soft, voluptuous curves of Marie Therese. Dora Maar seems to just be broken by Picasso's callousness. His intellectual equal is now shattered, and she is a jagged, sobbing mess. But Picasso, or I should say, one Picasso scholar surmised that he represented his dependence on women, and so he tried to overcome it by dominating them, often to the point of cruelty. So we can see this becomes a continuous theme, this idea of the weeping woman, Dora Maar, exposed in these like tragic, traumatic moments in her relationship with Pablo Picasso. It seems like she was in like a near constant state of emotional turmoil. So altogether, images like this seem to document this tortured, toxic relationship between the two of them. And it's kind of chilling to me to imagine Picasso sort of provoking this kind of pain in another individual and then sitting down and being inspired to make art from somebody else's tears. Dora Maar admitted, he used me until there was nothing left of me, nothing but the hundreds of portraits he painted. She didn't like any of them. And she always said, all the portraits of me are lies. They're Picasso's, not one is Dora Maar. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of Picasso's kind of magnum opus, the massive mural Guernica, which he painted in 1937. So this is done right in the middle of all of these very intense affairs that are happening in his life. Now, this is his great anti-war protest against the Spanish Civil War. It's 25 feet long. It's 11 and a half feet tall. You're never going to believe what happened as he was painting this work, where he is borrowing these notions of, the curved Marie Therese Walter and the weeping Dora Maar and inserting them into this massive mural. So as he's working on it, standing up on a ladder one day, these two women who had never actually met in real life both come in to his studio. And it was like this reaching this crisis point in his life. According to Picasso, they went into the studio, they began arguing, and Picasso just kept on painting as they were arguing, and they demanded that Picasso choose which one of them he wanted to be with. And he said, I'm satisfied with the way things are. Of course, it was working out for him just fine, right? So apparently, these two women began to wrestle in front of this anti-war incredible mural that we're looking at here. Said Picasso, oh, it was one of my choicest memories. He actually made a picture about these two women wrestling. This is called Birds in a Cage from 1937. Marie Therese Walter, the sweet little white dove over here, and Dora Maar with her prickly fingers is the triumphant black dove. Dora Maar moved in with Picasso, and he installed Marie Therese Walter and their daughter in a nearby flat. But he, of course, continues to see both of them, and for several more years. And it's so tempting to do these side-by-side comparisons when you can see that they're literally lying on the same bed in the same space. And so it's easy for us to imagine that the aesthetic decisions that he's making about these women are a reflection of his feelings about them on a given day. So we have sort of the serene and peaceful versus the agitation that we see in Dora Maar over on the right. Okay, so what happens next here? Well, we have another lover. Enter Francois Guillot, and she was unlike any of Picasso's other lovers. Here she is in two photographs. She um, she was born in 1921 and she died, I think, just a year or so ago. She'd been training to become an attorney and then dropped out of school to pursue her passion for the arts. And she had already had her first exhibition in Paris by the time she met Picasso in 1943. We can see that she's a real striking beauty. Francois Guillot and Pablo Picasso, here they are in 1951. She was just 23 years old when she met him, and he was 62 years old at the time. He actually wooed her for months before she finally surrendered her virginity to him. Now, despite her youth, she was very strong-willed and very self-confident. She refused to play the role of vulnerable lover. And we can see that Picasso responded to that strength. He was enamored by it. He would create these ethereal portraits of her where she's not sitting in an armchair across the room. Instead, she is the lover gazing into his eyes with this pile of loose swirling curves. There's a directness and a wonderful intimacy here. But oh yeah, just to compare, the other women were kind of objects that he was analyzing. So he was living in the south of France with Guillot, totally mesmerized by her, but all was not well there because Koklova actually lived fairly close to them, and she would kind of track their movements. She was still legally married to Picasso at this point, and occasionally she would even break into their house and attack Francois Guillot. So there were interventions made there. Picasso had to kind of break up these fights, but I think that he was sort of accustomed to women fighting over him, so he was not too disturbed by this. Now, of course, things always shift as they do when you're dating Picasso or married to Picasso, and so, as with all of Picasso's lovers, the honeymoon eventually ends, and Guillot gave birth to two of Picasso's children. Claude in 1946. Picasso's second son was born almost a quarter of a century after his first son. And then she also gave birth to Paloma 3 years later when Picasso was close to 70 years old. So, in this portrait with the green flesh and the clashing patterns, Guillot is represented as grotesque. All the cascading, swirling hair is gone, revealing a partially bald and distorted head here. He said to her, "You were a Venus when I met you. Now you're a Christ, and a Romanesque Christ at that, with all the ribs sticking out to be counted." Once, in the height of an argument, he threatened to burn her. He took the cigarette he was smoking and touched it to her right cheek and held it there. He apparently was expecting her to pull away, but Guillot said she was determined not to give him that satisfaction. So we have these images of Guillot over here as attending to her children, or at least surrounded by her children. But in both of these works, actually, she's making art here. And we can see her kind of working independently. And you sort of get the sense that it kind of drove Picasso nuts that he didn't have her full attention. He was almost jealous of it. One of his friends once chided him. It's easy to see there's a dimension of her inner life which has escaped you. So he's kind of lashing out at her with these less than flattering portraits here. Now, as we wrap up on Guillot, we can see that things are continuing to go in a negative trajectory. Picasso was continuing to cheat. Guillot hated the philandering, and he refused to stop. So she sinks into a depression. You can think of all of this discord in their relationship, and her sadness is sort of coming forth in images like the two that I have on the screen here. Over on the left, we see that or I'm sorry, on the right, we see that we're back to that intimate and direct portrait, almost similar to the kinds of images that he was making of her when they first fell in love. But now there's like a distance in her gaze. And of course, it's white lines on a black sheet of paper now. She's like a ghost of her formal self, her former self. So over here on the right too, we've got a little bit of like cubist flattening happening here and a sense of distress in the face. Picasso said to her, "Women are machines for suffering." And apparently, Picasso was so deeply impacted by Guillot's emotional state that he himself became so depressed that he contemplated suicide. So we wrap up with one last lover here, right on time. So Jacqueline Roch became a steadying presence in the final 2 decades of the artist's life. We can see her here. He just keeps dating younger and younger. She was 26 years old and Picasso was 72 when they first met. That is a 46-year age gap. So she was at this time younger than his first son. Picasso met Roch in 1952 at a pottery where he was making ceramics, and he romanced her by drawing a big dove in chalk on the side of her house and then bringing her a rose every day until she agreed to date him. So he was very persistent. Now, following the death of Olga Koklova in 1955, and Roch, who had been previously married, she got divorced. She officially becomes Picasso's second wife in 1961. And at that time, Picasso was 79 and she was just 34 years old. And even though they're married, he still had girlfriends. But she warned him, if one day there is another muse, I'll congratulate her. I'll send her flowers, but I'll be out the door. And from that point forward, he did not paint other women. And Jacqueline Roch exerted the greatest control over his contacts. So let's see how he portrayed Jacqueline Roch. He was greatly inspired by her, and he created more works of her than any other woman in his life. One year, he painted 70 portraits of her alone. Jacqueline was the only woman he painted for the last 17 years of his life, and Picasso developed a specific aesthetic for Roch. He often showed her with this very long neck that we see in both of these portraits, and a long Greek nose, sort of based off of her appearance, but a little bit exaggerated. And in these two works here, I think you sort of get this sense that she's a sphinx. She's a protector. She's vigilant here. She is looking to make sure that this relationship is secure, I think. There's a little bit about her that reminds me of Francois Guillot, in that they both have these elegant features here, but there isn't that same kind of intimacy. He's turned this lovely lady over here in profile, and he's stretched her out and made her more angular. And he'd sort of run through all of his styles with Jacqueline Roch towards the end of his life, even dipping back into realism at one point. An image like this almost reminds me of images of Olga, or maybe even that first image that we saw of his mother when he was a teenager, sitting in profile. So we can read a lot into these portraits of Jacqueline Roch at the end of his life and at the end of his career. These works could be almost easily mistaken for images of Marie-Therese Walter. I mean, we have these nice kind of undulating lines to describe the body here. But one of the things that he does to define Jacqueline Roch is that he gives her this very prominent nose that slices her forehead, slices through her forehead in each of the images, and then also sort of makes it look like there are two faces pointed at each other in depictions of Roch as well. These two works were created the year that they were married. And here we see two images of Roch alongside Picasso's beloved dog, Cobble here. And there's like this suggestion that Roch is like as faithful as man's best friend with some of these portraits as well. All right. So one last almost terrifying picture from this section. It's called The Kiss from 1969. This is painted at a time when he and Roch were essentially living in isolation. And here they are pressed together very close to the surface of the picture plane, and they are distorted. And it's kind of hard to tell if this is like a passionate, feverish kiss, or is this a tender and serene one? Is it something else altogether? But in any event, Picasso is really dominating the picture here. And it seems to be a picture that is about him and his thoughts, his desires, and his needs. So that's a nice moment to sort of shift gears and wrap things up on all of these characters that we've met today. What happened to Olga? Well, just as a reminder, beginning in 1917, Olga and Picasso were together for 18 years, but remained officially married until her death. Koklova continued to send Picasso hate mail even after their separation. And when their son Paolo became Picasso's chauffeur, she began to live out of a suitcase and follow the two of them around Europe. Many of Picasso's friends considered her mad due to her behavior. She asked to see her husband later in life when she was nearing death, and he refused. She died in 1955. What then of Marie Therese Walter? Picasso continued to visit Walter and his daughter twice a week for nearly 10 years throughout the 1940s. In 1955, after Koklova died, apparently Picasso called Marie Therese Walter and asked her to marry him, but she refused. After Picasso's death in 1973, Walter found her continued life without him very difficult. In 1977, 4 years after Picasso's death, she hanged herself at the age of 68. How about Dora Maar? Dora Maar, let's see. When Picasso ended their relationship, Dora Maar had a total mental breakdown, which essentially led to a lifelong depression. He sent her to a mental hospital to recover, and she was treated with electroshock therapy. A friend came to her aid and persuaded Picasso to remove her from the hospital, accusing that the artist was making her suffer. He bought her a house in the south of France, and she retired there alone. Maar never took another lover, famously pronouncing, after Picasso, God. That's where she started to embrace Catholicism and ended up started painting abstract pieces. She actually spent the last few years of her life back in Paris, totally impoverished and reclusive. She died at the age of 89 in 1997. In recent years, there's been renewed interest in her photographs with an internationally touring exhibition. And then we have Jacqueline Roque, our Sphinx, right? She married and remained with Picasso some 20 years until his death. She was devoted to him and a fierce protector of Picasso's privacy. She actually banned his children and a large part of his family from attending his funeral. And as a result, Pablito, his grandson, committed suicide by drinking bleach. The same night that Picasso died, she slept on his grave and in the snow. In the next year, she devoted herself to the creation of the Picasso Museum in Paris, which was born out of a dispute with Picasso's children regarding their inheritance. When his estate was essentially settled, that's when the depression and the alcohol came. Finally, when she was feeling like she had done enough for his life as she could, she committed suicide by shooting at the age of 60 in the castle where she had lived with Picasso. It was 1986, 13 years after Picasso's death. And then we have the one that got away. Francoise Guillot was the one woman to leave Picasso. And remarkably, she lived a nice, long, rich life. She just died last year. Um, she said, one's ego is not satisfied by the fact that one had been painted by Picasso. She was the artist in her own right, remember? So even though Picasso tried to sabotage her career, told dealers not to work with her or sell her work, she made money on her own. She actually wrote a 1964 book called Life with Picasso. It sold millions of copies. Picasso was so mad at her about the book that he refused to ever visit her children anymore. Nevertheless, the book sales provided money for her children to live off of, but they did try to do a legal fight to become actual heirs to Picasso because he was still married to Koklova when they were born. So in 1969, Francois Guillot actually met the creator of the polio vaccine, Jonas Salk, and she married him the next year. She was at a cocktail party one day, and somebody came up to her and said, "What was it like to have been the partner of Picasso and then also Jonas Salk, like these two incredible figures of the 20th century?" To which she replied, "Why don't you ask them what it was like to be with me?" So I sort of love her for it. Just a few years ago, the New York Times referred to her as an it girl in the art world, and she was about 100 years old at the time. So her paintings these days sell for just north of $1 million. And then Picasso himself, I had this slide up in my house last night as I was reviewing it. My 5-year-old walks up to me and says, "That's a monster." It's a self-portrait of the artist. It's called Self-Portrait Facing Death from 1972. In the last 4 years of Picasso's life, he created more than any other period in his entire life. He worked right up until the day he died at age 91. He was literally painting until 3 o'clock in the morning that day. This is such a haunting image, thinking of the artist, thinking of his own demise. So here is the castle, the chateau that he had been living in with Jacqueline Roque. He's buried on the grounds there. And Jacqueline arranged for Picasso to be buried with this view kind of this beloved estate. And this bronze sculpture that was inspired by Marie-Therese Walter that integrates these elements of like a fertility goddess is what marks his grave there. So we wrap up with Picasso here. There he is. I think that's Jacqueline Roque behind him, but the painting of Koklova in the background. He dies at age 91. He leaves behind an astounding number of works, 45,000 pieces. At the time of his death, his net worth was estimated to be somewhere between $100 million and $250 million. If you adjust that for inflation today, it could go all the way up to like a billion, which is not surprising. Several of his descendants acknowledge the importance of Picasso's relationships on his art, as well as his cannibalistic tendencies. Uh, One of his granddaughters later wrote, "He submitted them to his animal sexuality, tamed them, bewitched them, ingested them, and crushed them into his canvas. After he spent many nights extracting their essence, once they were blood dry, he would dispose of them." Well, hopefully, I feel like they got their day today because we have a better understanding of who they were and how they inspired this modern master. Perhaps he would not have been able to paint and the images that we know and love today without these women in his life. So we have a lot to thank them for. So we are at just about an hour now. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Picasso and all of these women in his life. I'll start looking at the Q&A here. Um, oh, great question. Okay. Okay, so Ellen asked, was he bipolar? I'm not sure if he was ever diagnosed with anything in particular. There were certainly periods of depression in his life. Um, I think people might closely associate him with like a sort of narcissism too, because there was this inflated ego, because there was this disregard for the feelings of women in his life. But it does seem like he struggled with depression at different points in his career too. And someone asked, why was Marie-Therese Walter's face obscured in the painting where she was breastfeeding? I was wondering about that too, and it doesn't align with any known pandemic at the time. I don't think it, I think that was from 1935. When I first glanced at it, I thought, oh my God, is that the Spanish flu? But I'm not sure as to why. Carol, oh, thanks for being here, Carol. She says, is that a cigarette burn on Gilou's face in the white outline on black paper? Ooh, that's a great question. I'm not sure if she was actually disfigured by any sort of cigarette burn. It looks as though there was a dot on her face, even at the beginning of their relationship where they were still moony in love, but that's a really good attention to detail, Carol. Um, I think there was a sort of a pronounced, yeah, dot on her face there at the end. Um, Carol says, did Nazi France in World War II affect these women? Yes, very much so. And I'm just thinking right back now to my experience at the Currier Museum where I used to work because they have a painting from Picasso who was essentially like under house arrest um, during his time in France during World War II. And so he created these very claustrophobic scenes. The picture at the Currier is almost certainly of Dora Maar, and he flattened her out, going back to that quote, every woman's a goddess or a doormat. He made a doormat during that time. So I think that sense of claustrophobia certainly came out and would have impacted images of Dora Maar and probably Marie Therese Walter around that time. Julie asked, did Picasso keep journals or write a book discussing his life? Great question, Julie. Off the top of my head, not that I know of, but he did work with biographers during his life. Somebody else asked, do they know where each of his paintings are today? Yes, for the most part, probably. I did mention 45,000 works. Probably not where every single one of those works are. I remember hearing stories years ago that like Picasso would pay for a big dinner bill just by drawing on a napkin, and then somebody could have an original Picasso. And like I said, they are frequently faked too, so that's a little bit hard to know. Somebody else asked about his mother. I'm not sure what ended. I sort of did a deep dive into his mother when I was first putting this together a few years ago, but I sort of lost track of what happened to her. Uh, um, I won't even I won't even try to recall because I don't think I'm going to be correct if I try to do that. But that's something that we could certainly look up. Let's see here. Going back to the chat. Nina, thanks for being here. She said, who painted the first painting? That was Jean-Dominique Eng, the French neoclassical painter. And it's like an imagined portrait of Raphael. And oh, Susan says she looks like a snake. I wonder if you were referring to this picture of Marie Therese Walter. And oh, somebody said high expectations for my presentation. I hope I met your expectations. And let's see here. Thank you for the kind words, Karen and Nancy, Helen too, Shirley. I recommend the book Cooking for Picasso. Ooh, that sounds interesting, Susan. Thanks for the recommendation. Thank you, everybody, for your very kind words. I really appreciate it. Was any of his work captured during World War II? Nancy, I have a feeling that that is probably the case, but I'm not as familiar with those stories as I should be. I should look into that. Thank you for asking about that. Um, how many versions of Las Meninas did he do? Oh, Julie, good question. Off the top of my head, I have no idea. Sorry about that. There, what a long life, what a prolific career. It was really hard for me to find a way to give a nice overview of it, but to also talk about these women and the impact that they had. So I'm sorry, there are huge gaps that I have in terms of internalizing everything there is to know about Picasso. I mean, we could all dedicate our lives to doing just that, right? So thank you, everybody, for your kind words. Thanks for spending your morning with me, waking up early or staying up late, depending on where you are in the world. I am very grateful for it.
So, folks, let's give Jane another big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. Jane will be back with us in 2 weeks on Thursday, July 25th at 10:30 to talk about Parisian cafes and Impressionist paintings. And obviously Paris, France is going to be in the news with the Olympics hosting, and we're doing a bunch of armchair travel and art history related to France in the coming weeks. So look for that. Link is in the chat, and I'll also include it in the next email. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Jane.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.